Good morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. This is going to be a lecture on the second half of photosynthesis, which is the Calvin cycle. Hopefully, the video all works for this one. I apologize that it didn't on the first light reactions video, but I'm hoping it works on this one. So today we're going to talk about the Calvin cycle, where we're going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fix it into organic molecules present already in the stroma of the chloroplast and generate organic molecules that the plant can use for itself. So what we're going to take a look at here is the Calvin cycle. Man, that's the wrong Calvin. That's Calvin and from Calvin and Hobbes. Who we're talking about here is actually Melvin Calvin, who figured out the steps of the Calvin cycle. He was a professor at Cal Berkeley, did his work in the 50s, won the Nobel Prize in 1961 for figuring out the steps of the Calvin cycle. So if you remember, the light reactions converted solar energy, light energy, right, to chemical energy, ATP and NADPH, which is going to have that reducing power. It's going to allow us to reduce carbon dioxide and generate organic molecules the plant can use, right? So we're going to build stuff, right? We took care of the photo part in the light reactions. Now we're going to look at the synthesis part of photosynthesis, okay? So we're going to make glucose, essentially, the synthesis reaction, right? So the raw materials that are available to the plant to do this are carbon dioxide, as well as NADPH, which is going to be oxidized. And when it is oxidized, it then reduces carbon dioxide. And we're also going to use ATP from the light reactions. The cool thing about this, what happens in the Calvin cycle with NADPH is once it is oxidized and drops off its electrons, it's converted back to NADP, which can go back to the light reactions to collect more electrons, right? So we are recycling the NADP. We're also going to recycle the ADP, so it can go back to the light reactions as well. And this taking carbon dioxide, the gaseous form of carbon, out of the atmosphere and putting it into organic molecules in living things is referred to as carbon fixation. Okay, so carbon dioxide is fully oxidized, right? So it has very little chemical energy. There's very little energy stored in the bonds between carbon and oxygen. Whereas glucose has a lot of chemical energy stored in those carbon-carbon bonds and those carbon-hydrogen bonds because it is highly reduced. So this synthesis reaction that takes place during the Calvin cycle is an endergonic process. So there's going to be a lot of energy put in to build glucose from carbon dioxide. And there's a lot of small little steps that are used to reduce carbon dioxide into glucose, okay? And there are specific enzymes, again, that are used at each of those steps. You're going to need to know the name of one of the enzymes that is used, okay? And like I mentioned, we're going to use the energy that's stored in ATP and NADPH. Okay, so the Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast, right? Whereas the light reactions took place within the thylakoids, okay? But the Calvin cycle cannot take place without the products of the light reactions to drive these reactions. So ATP and NADPH have to be used in order to drive the Calvin cycle. So that's, again, why we said I don't like to refer to the Calvin cycle as the dark reactions. It's going to be really hard for the Calvin cycle to take place in the dark because the plant is not generating ATP or NADPH within its chloroplasts in the dark. Okay, so there are three stages or phases to the Calvin cycle. Okay, the first phase is called carbon fixation. So one carbon dioxide molecule, easy for me to say, one carbon dioxide molecule will be incorporated into the Calvin cycle at a time, okay? And each CO2 is added to one 5-carbon molecule that's already present in the stroma of the chloroplast called ribulose bisphosphate, or RUBP for short. And that's all you need to know it as is RUBP, okay? The enzyme that fixes or attaches the CO2 onto the RUBP is called Rubisco, which is short for ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase. Ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase is not a name you need to remember. Rubisco is. Rubisco is the most abundant enzyme and therefore most abundant protein on the planet. There are thousands of copies of that enzyme in every chloroplast of every single mesophyll cell in every single plant. Okay. And when you think that there are 30 to 40 chloroplasts in a typical mesophyll cell, and you think about every blade of grass and every leaf on every plant having 30 to 40 chloroplasts loaded with Rubisco in every one of its photosynthetic cells, that is a ton of Rubisco on this planet. Okay. So when one carbon dioxide is added to a 5-carbon compound, that creates a 6-carbon compound, which is really unstable. It has these 2 phosphate groups on it that destabilize it. Adding that carbon to this 5-carbon chain already creates a highly unstable 6-carbon molecule that immediately splits into 2 3-carbon molecules called 3-PGA, which is short for phosphoglycerate. Okay, so now I'm not referring to, the golf tour. Okay, so that is carbon fixation, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and incorporating it into an organic compound, RUBP, that is present in the stroma, and then enzyme is required to do that. Okay, so we're looking at 3 CO2 going in one at a time, each one being added to a different RUBP, right? So if we have 3 RUBP, that's 15 carbons in the Calvin cycle to start. We've added 3 carbons, 1 to each of those 3 RUBP. So we then have 3 6-carbon compounds for a total of 18 carbons in the Calvin cycle. Those 3 6-carbon compounds immediately split in half, creating 6 3-carbon compounds called 3-PGA. So we still have 18 carbons in the Calvin cycle at this point. Okay. The second phase of the Calvin cycle is referred to as the reduction phase. So this is where the ATP and the NADPH that were made in the light reactions start to get used. Okay. Each one of these 3-PGA molecules is phosphorylated by an ATP. So there's 6 3-PGA molecules, meaning 6 ATP have to be used, 1 ATP per PGA. So they all are phosphorylated, creating these 3-carbon compounds, each with 2 phosphate groups on them. Okay. We still have 6 of those 3-carbon compounds though. So there's still 18 carbons in the Calvin cycle. Okay. Once all those PGA molecules are phosphorylated, then these molecules are reduced. Each one is reduced by an NADPH molecule. So our 6 3-carbon compounds here all get reduced now. They all have electrons added to them. And that means the NADPH is oxidized, recycling back NADP+, which then cycles back to the light reactions, okay? Just as the ADP that's generated in the previous step also goes back to the light reactions. So now, after that reduction phase, where the NADPH drops off its electrons, we have 6 3-carbon compounds called G3P, which you should remember was one of our intermediate molecules in glycolysis of cellular respiration. Okay, now we're sitting here with 18 carbons in our cycle, right? 6 3-carbon compounds. In order to get back to where we started with 3 5-carbon compounds, which means 15 carbons in the cycle. So for every 3 CO2 that enter the Calvin cycle, 1 net G3P is generated that leaves the cycle. The other 5 3-carbon compounds remain in the cycle. So if we have 5 3-carbon compounds, that means we have 15 carbons back in the cycle. Okay. So just to kind of review here, ATP adds a phosphate to 3-PGA. NADPH reduces 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. For every 3 CO2 that enter, 6 G3P are produced, which is a net gain of 1 G3P because we started with 15 carbons in the Calvin cycle. We now have 18. The 1 G3P will exit the cycle. The other 5 remain in, meaning we're back to having 15 carbons in the cycle. Okay. So the third phase of the Calvin cycle is regenerating our starting compound. That's what makes it a cycle as we get back to where we started from. So those 5 G3P that remain are through many, many different steps, and the use of 3 more ATP are rearranged back into 3 RUBP molecules. Now, one thing I want you to understand is I'm kind of waving a magic wand over a whole bunch of steps, and that's okay. You don't need to know those, all of those steps. The other thing I want you to remember is we said that sometimes we have to have cyclic phosphorylation or cyclic electron transport occurring during the light reactions, because the Calvin cycle uses more ATP than it does NADPH. And here is where we use those 3 additional ATP. So you can see we're using more ATP than NADPH here in the Calvin cycle. Now, you want to see what I'm waving my magic wand over? These are the steps of the Calvin cycle. So we'll look here. Here's where the 3CO2 come in. Rubisco adds them to the RUBP that's available, generating 3-PGA. ATP is used, generating 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. NADPH reduces the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to G3P. All of this down here, those are the steps I'm waving my magic wand over and saying a whole bunch of steps occur and G3P gets rearranged into RUBP. I hope you're okay that I'm waving my magic wand over all these steps, but if you're not, too bad, sorry, that's what I'm doing. You can study these on your own. I'm not going to hold you responsible for them. But figuring out all these steps is what earned Calvin, whose first name, by the way, is Melvin, so Melvin Calvin, that's what earned him the Nobel Prize in 1961. So just a quick note, remember G3P here from glycolysis, right? Well, what plants can do in photosynthesis, if they generate enough G3P, is they essentially are going to run glycolysis backwards, and they're going to convert G3P into glucose, okay? So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is actually the product of the Calvin cycle, not glucose, not sucrose, not starch, G3P, the 1,3-carbon compound, which plants can then use to generate glucose, and then their other carbohydrates, to generate their lipids. It's the starting material to build their lipids that they need, phospholipids for the cell membrane, fats they need for storage, waxes to cover their leaves. It is a starting material for building any of the amino acids they need to make their proteins, the starting material to make any of their nucleic acids, their DNA and their RNA. So G3P is this really important intermediate molecule. It's storing a lot of energy because it's got a lot of carbon, hydrogen, and carbon-carbon bonds, and it is used by the plant to build every other molecule that it needs. Because remember, plants don't eat anything, right? They have to build all of their own organic molecules. The type of photosynthesis that generates G3P, because it is a 3-carbon compound, is called C3 photosynthesis. There are a couple of alternative pathways called C4 photosynthesis and CAM photosynthesis. We are not going to learn about those. They are in your book if you're interested in reading about those, but it's not required by the College Board. And in the interest of time, especially this year, we won't be covering those. Okay, a little bit about Rubisco that fixes carbon from the air. Ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, the most important and abundant enzyme in the world. Without it, life doesn't exist, okay? So it is super duper important. So let's take a look at photosynthesis here. So 3 turns of the Calvin cycle gives us 1 G3P. So 3 CO2 coming in gives us 1 G3P. That counts as 3 turns of the Calvin cycle, 1 turn for each CO2. 6 turns of the Calvin cycle would be needed to give us 1 glucose, because you'd have to fix 6 CO2 molecules out of the atmosphere to make glucose, okay? In order to make glucose, you'd have to use 18 ATP and 12 NADPH, because in that reduction phase, we used 6 ATP and 6 NADH to make 1 G3P. And then in a regeneration phase, we used 3 more ATP, right? So in producing 1 G3P, we use 9 ATP and 12 NADPH. In order to generate 1 glucose, Calvin cycle has to go around 6 times, which means that we're going to use 18 ATP and 12 NADPH. Any ATP that's left over from the light reactions, by the way, you might be like, well, the light reactions probably make, it seems like they'd be making a lot of ATP since light's constantly hitting the leaves of the plant. That's true. If there's any ATP that's left over from those light reactions, it can be used elsewhere by the cell. All right, so light reactions, just to review, remember, used sunlight and water to generate NADPH and ATP, and oxygen was produced as a waste product. Okay, now the plant can use some of that oxygen in its own cellular respiration, but a lot of that oxygen leaves the leaf through the stomata after photosynthesis, after being formed during the light reactions, right? So it's important to remember that the splitting of water is what generates that oxygen. Okay. So light reactions produce ATP and NADPH and release O2 as a waste product. The ATP and NADPH are going to be used along with carbon dioxide in the Calvin cycle to generate sugars like G3P. And the NADP and the ADP are recycled back to the light reactions. Okay. So this builds sugars by using ATP and NADPH and recycles ADP and NADP. And remember, the addition of carbon out of the atmosphere into our organic compounds in the stroma is referred to as carbon fixation. And remember, the Calvin cycle is in the stroma, light reactions within the thylakoid. Okay, so this kind of puts it all together here. So plants are making energy in the form of ATP and NADPH and then using those to make their sugars. So one point that the College Board's curriculum guide emphasizes and points out, and so does your book, is that when we think about photosynthesis, we should also think about cell respiration because photosynthesis and cell respiration essentially create this cycle of energy within our planet, right? Photosynthesis uses sunlight and the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from the soil to generate glucose and oxygen gas, which are then the reactants of cellular respiration, which generates ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. And the carbon dioxide and water are then used, right, by plants in photosynthesis. So there's this cycle where the products of photosynthesis become the reactants of respiration, and the reactants of, or the products of cellular respiration become the reactants of photosynthesis. Okay. And also do remember, plants carry out cellular respiration. Plants have mitochondria. Plants are always carrying out cellular respiration in the daytime and at nighttime. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, is mostly in the daytime. Okay, so where did the carbon dioxide come from? The atmosphere. Where does it go? Into the stroma to be attached to RUBP to eventually generate G3P. Okay, so the carbon dioxide eventually ends up in the G3P, which eventually ends up being used to make glucose. So the CO2 essentially ends up in the glucose molecule here. Where'd the water come from? The soil, right? And then the roots, it is absorbed by the roots, brought up to the leaves by the xylem, and used in the light reactions as a source of electrons. Where did the water go? The electrons were used in the electron transport chain of the light reactions to make a proton gradient that was used to make ATP, and then they eventually end up in the NADPH molecules that go to the Calvin cycle and drop those electrons off in the organic compounds in the Calvin cycle. And so those electrons eventually end up in G3P and glucose. Okay, the oxygen from water is released as a waste product. The protons from the water remain in the thylakoid, building up that proton gradient. Where'd the energy come from? The sun, right? Photosynthesis is solar powered. What is the energy used for? It is used to help reduce carbon dioxide and form G3P. What will the C6H12O6 be used for? It is used to as an energy molecule, right? The plant will break that down in cellular respiration to generate ATP. Where'd the oxygen come from? The splitting of water. Where will the oxygen go? It will leave the chloroplast, it will leave the cell, and it will exit the leaf through the stomata. What else is involved but not listed in this equation? ATP, NADPH. Okay. All right, so photosynthesis is probably the most important process on our planet. It captures about 121 billion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and generates about 160 billion tons of carbohydrate. Okay, and recall, heterotrophs are dependent on plants as a food source for their fuel and their raw materials. All right, and so everything is just kind of a poetic perspective, kind of an artistic perspective, that everything on this planet is really particles of air, like carbon dioxide, woven together by strands of sunlight. All right, and there's a video that we will watch in class from the book on photosynthesis. And that is where I'm going to stop for today. If you have any questions, please sign up for an academic support time or ask them in class. So I will see you all next class, whether that is Monday or Tuesday.